The Gospel of John ends with, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." But this is not really the ending of John. This is the last verse of chapter 20. There is a whole chapter after this. But this passage we read sounds like a fitting end to the gospel. Because of this, many have argued John 21 was added on by a later scribe to solve issues in the church after the gospel author had passed. But this hypothesis is riddled with problems that manifest when we dive a little deeper. Internal evidence reveals the author of chapter 21 was most likely the same author of the whole gospel. The first thing to note is the manuscript evidence has never revealed a version of John's Gospel lacking chapter 21. As far as the manuscripts are concerned, chapter 21 was a part of the original narrative. Therefore, proponents of the hypothesis that chapter 21 was added later have to appeal to internal evidence. They highlight the ending of chapter 20 as their main piece of evidence because it seems like a fitting end. Chapter 21 may have been added to reiterate the ecclesiastical leadership of Peter, since it narrates Jesus restoring Peter to himself. It is argued this may have been an attempt by a later author to dispel competing claims that another apostle was meant to be the leader of the church. Another important aspect of the chapter is that it dispels a myth that the beloved disciple would live until Jesus returns. Skeptics assert the beloved disciple may have died at this point, and so the chapter was added to correct a misunderstanding that Jesus would return before he died. However, there's a much simpler explanation, which is that chapter 21 simply functions as the epilogue of the gospel. So we can agree that John 20:31 is the ending of the main body, whereas the final chapter is an epilogue. And this should be expected, since the opening of the main body is really John 1:19. What we have prior to this is John's prologue. Richard Bauckham says, "The prologue sketches the prehistory to the gospel story, while the epilogue foresees its post-history. Just as the prologue goes back in time to creation, so the epilogue previews the future mission of the disciples, symbolized by the miraculous catch of fish, and focuses especially on the different roles that Peter and the beloved disciple are to play in it." Bauckham notes if we compare John's prologue and epilogue, we find numerous points of contact. The prologue consists of 496 syllables, whereas the epilogue has 496 Greek words. This correspondence is expected, since the prologue is poetic, whereas the epilogue is narrative. Also, 496 is a triangular number, and is also the numerical value of monogenes, the Greek word for only used in John 3:16. Ancient authors love to use numerical values for hidden meanings. Matthew does this in his genealogy to point to Jesus being the heir of David. John probably used a similar method for his prologue and epilogue. Additionally, in Jesus' last words, he says, "Until I come," which corresponds to the first words of the prologue, "in the beginning." Nathanael is present at the beginning of the epilogue and introduced shortly after the prologue. He shows up nowhere else in the gospel. Andreas Kostenberger says, "The postscript, vis-a-vis the preface, provides balance and symmetry to the structure of the gospel. Both units form an integral part of the theological and literary fabric of the entire narrative. Among other things, John 21 resolves the relationship between Peter and the beloved disciple in terms of non-competition and identifies the latter as the fourth evangelist. Beyond this, there are many other terminological links between the final chapter and the rest of the gospel." Next, we can compare the ending of chapter 20 with 21, and we find aspects that fit together. Both together speak of what has been written and not written. Both consist of 43 Greek words. The first conclusion speaks of many other signs that Jesus did, and the second states there were many other things that Jesus did. The first ends with Jesus' disciples, and the second ending focuses in on the author, the disciple whom Jesus loved, in his important role. Leon Morris adds that in the chapter, John often refers to Peter as Simon Peter, which is consistent with John's overall style. But when Jesus speaks to Peter, he refers to him merely as Simon, which is unlike John's style. Andreas Kostenberger draws attention to other similarities in style and language, like the similar language for taking and distributing the bread found in John 6:11, and the use of the phrase Sea of Tiberias. In fact, De Soligus and Vachereau evaluated the style and vocabulary of chapter 21 and found no significant variation from the language of the rest of the Gospel. If chapter 21 was not written by John, the beloved disciple, it was written by a clever forger who disguised himself well. Craig Blomberg notes that many scholars today agree John 21 was written by John. It is not nearly as unusual today as it was a half a century ago to find scholarly support for John 21 as an integral part of the overall Gospel, composed by the same hand that was responsible for the majority of chapters 1 to 20. As for the theological aspects of chapter 21, it is not necessary to presume they had to come from a later scribe. John himself may have thought these points were important to include to dispel rumors in his day, which was the late 1st century. There is nothing in chapter 21 which necessarily has to be attributed to a later scribe. Thus, from internal evidence alone, we can see there's no reason to think John 21 was written by a later scribe who added to the Gospel of John. All the evidence points in the direction that the author of chapter 21 is the same author of the rest of the Gospel. Some scholars have speculated that chapter 21 was added by John himself at a later point, which is of course possible. But either way, John would still be the author of the whole Gospel. Chapter 21 is best understood as an epilogue and is crucial for the whole structure of John's Gospel.